our first Voices of Poetry event at this gallery. It's our first Voices of Poetry event in Provincetown, in fact. We've had Voices of Poetry events at other venues on the Cape, but I was really psyched about having one here in P-Town because it's such a great literary tradition in this town. Just a couple of blocks away, you have Mailer's home, and Dos Passos, his home, and Millay stayed here, and more recently Tony Kushner lived here. And it still is a very vibrant community for poetry, writing, and the arts. And among the arts are those things you'll see on the wall behind me. As I said, this is not a museum. The art here is for sale. If you want to go home with it, you can. You just have to pay to get money, that's all. It seems like a very reasonable exchange. Speaking of money, there is a tin can which I will pass around shortly, into which we suggest that you deposit $10 so we can offer honoraria to the poets and musician. This is a suggestion, like when your mother told you she suggested you eat your vegetables, or suggested you stand straight, or suggested you support the arts. It's a suggestion. If you want to donate more, you can. If you have some excess jewelry on your person that you want to get rid of, we will melt it down. Some credit cards that you're not using, by all means. And conversely, if you're a bit dry and don't have $10, that's fine too. We won't throw you out. We are waiting for one poet to show up. Poets are not known for their punctuality, so yes. And you have, or you should have, or your neighbor should have, bios for each of the poets who are reading tonight and the musician who's playing tonight. That spares me the task of having introduced them all. And so you have much more information there that I could possibly share with you. Please tell me this is Melanie. And no, it isn't.
Her Facebook status says some kind of major crash on 6A
That's right, that's
in
what I saw.
Brewster.
Oh, okay.
In Brewster?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So we will draw out our vowels.
Everybody reads various.
And also, Charles Fort, one of the poets who was on bat tonight, is experiencing car problems in the sense that he doesn't have one. So I will be reading in Charles's place. I'll be reading my work, not Charles's work. And we'll start off with a poem. Looking at the faces here, some of you may recall the 64 World's Fair, which is our 50th anniversary last year of the 64 World's Fair. And since this poem was just picked up by a lit journal, I thought I would share it with you, called World of Tomorrow. We were promised flying cars in this world of tomorrow, which arrived unheralded last week. We were sure that by now we would have flying cars, with tail fins and reclining bucket seats to go along with personal jetpacks strapped onto our torsos, like full-length seltzer bottles waiting to explode with lightest squeeze on the trigger. If they could put a man on the moon, why not in Midtown, among the cirrus and cumulus, with alternate side of the street parking, and us, once and for all, suspended. I had mapped out my flight patterns, choosing the best lanes to get crosstown, past the 34th floor of the Chrysler building, where I could double park outside my window. But, given the lies on which we were suckled and suckered, the whole milk, red meat, domino theory, body count, Marlboro Man, social mobility, myths on which we were nursed, this was to be expected. After all, the future ain't what it used to be. Today is the anniversary of the death of Bobby Kennedy. The 47th anniversary of the death of Bobby Kennedy. Yeah. Talk about freezing moment in time. I remember where I was. I think those of us who were alive on that day will remember where we were. The first campaign that summer, actually that spring, summer had not arrived yet. That spring, my oldest brother, Mark, who was then 19 years old, worked on Bobby Kennedy's campaign in New York City. And I tagged along. I was 11 years old. I tagged along stuffing and sealing envelopes. Because if my brother walked on hot coals, I would walk on hot coals behind him. And so I went along, and Mark kind of humored me, and I stuffed and sealed envelopes for Bobby. This poem is about that. Licking for Bobby. One envelope tastes so much like another to a 12-year-old tongue, with reserves of saliva drained, then replenished, with that residual taste of, was it spearmint? stacks of envelopes waiting to be kissed by my virgin lips, but only after they were filled with flyers exhorting the recipients to give a damn, be part of the solution, not the problem, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, end the war quickly before my elder brother, like his, could be killed. On each flyer, a black and white photo of the junior senator from New York, emerging from the roof of a car, leaning toward the cheering throngs, pounding the flesh, tempting fate, squinting, his toothy grin and outstretched hand and cowlick tucked neatly into each envelope, as I would be tucked into bed that evening. After my tongue was drained, I returned home to find dinner waiting, convinced that I had given a damn, been part of the solution, helped feed the poor, clothe the naked, end the war, which would last another 5 years. A delusion which went down well with meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and spearmint. I am fascinated by, thank God, so on. Melanie Braverman. I am fascinated by many things, but among which is the Bible, Old Testament mostly. One of the great stories in the Bible is the story of Jacob wrestling with an angel. For those of you who didn't go to Sunday school or Saturday school or any kind of school, Jacob wrestles with an angel, and his name becomes Israel, and we got into a lot of trouble. But basically, it is a momentous moment. It is the first time in the Old Testament where the interaction between man and God, or between man and an angel, is more than just a conversation. It's actually a physical altercation. It's a boxing match. This is called the main event. It begins with an epigraph from Genesis. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. Genesis 32:24. Gentlemen, you know the rules. I want a good, clean fight. No rubber punches, no kidney punches, no graven images. No blows below the belt. No invoking my name or biting or scratching. No gouging of eyes or beating of wings. No glimpses of mortality. No slaying of the firstborn. 12 rounds regulation match. The winner will be by TKO and will receive, in addition to the usual prize money, a new name instead of luggage, good for a millennia of wandering. Shake hands, go to your tents, come out fighting. Maybe because I write or I have a sympathetic face, people always tell me these tales of woe, hoping that I'll convert them into poetry, which I do. Recently, several friends confided in me, big mistake, about terrible childhood experiences surrounding the secrecy, so I changed the names. I haven't mentioned any names. But every time they do this, I mean, I listen attentively, and there are some similarities. So, this is called, but wait, there's more, which is a great line. Michael loves titles. I hope he approves of that.
It's okay.
Thanks. Michael's also very harsh. She sheds misery as snakes lose skin, first in bits, then whole sheets, molting perfectly formed trauma, leaving exposed flesh raw and tender. And I think this must be the way Eve broke the news to her neighbors, in pieces over coffee. First the exile, then the murder. Or did the murder come first, she could no longer recall, followed by the rape by her remaining son, doling these out so she would not be shattered with each retelling. Or perhaps this is how such news should be shared, leaving a bit of horror waiting in the wings, rubbing chalk on its hands. Who here is familiar with the artwork of Mark Rothko? All of us. In '82, I visited the Rothko murals at the Tate in London. And there, standing next to me, were, and if you haven't been to the Tate and haven't seen the Rothko murals, go check it out, they're amazing. There, standing next to me, was this very impeccably dressed British couple. And her only comment, a gentleman was clutching this guide to the Tate, as though looking the fastest route to get the hell out of this gallery, into which they just wandered in. And she just came inside, and the only thing she said was, "Too high." and I wrote that down. I was 1982. I wrote that down on my guide to the Tate, "Too high," and I thought I got to do something with that. And 30 years later, I finally finished the poem, which will be published shortly. So people ask, how long do you work on a poem? Much too long. Too high upon visiting Rothko's murals at the Tate. Too high, she says, as though surveying a gallows and gauging the distance between neck and beam. Don't quite get it, he quietly replies, as though he had just finished listening to a joke patiently told in Aramaic. They jointly thumb through the museum directory, searching for the most direct route to the gift shop, where they will find smaller editions of the masters, which they will get. They will not get these, somber grouping, ill-suited to a gift shop or a restaurant, even a posh one, where they might put the diner off his medium rare or his claret, whose red is not of peasant caps from Bruegel, or one of Fra Angelico's Visiting Angels, or even Matisse's swirling red settee on which a nude momentarily reclines. Theirs is the brick red of coagulation, of arterial spray left to dry, of earthen ditches in his native Latvia, into which he and his kin would have been tossed when they were still Rothkowitz. These oversized family portraits with interior frames awaiting undersized relatives. A landscape of carnage left to the imagination, a crime scene with evidence of the crime painstakingly but not entirely removed. 12 years later, he would paint his final canvas, 6 by 8 feet, in the same color, with his own paint and thick black socks. There's a footnote. On February 25, 1970, the artist Mark Rothko was found in his Manhattan studio. He had overdosed on barbiturates and cut an artery in his right arm with a razor blade. He was found in a pool of blood 6 by 8 feet wide, wearing long johns and thick black socks. He left no note. He was 66. And it recently was Allen Ginsberg's birthday. A man who left a momentous impact. And I'm looking for the companion poem to this. I apologize, just bear with me for 1 second. These are 2 poems. As I said, I'm writing a series of poems based on biblical characters. And this is about a boy and his mom. The mom happens to be Mary, the boy happens to be you-know-who. First, from the mom's perspective. Mother's Day. After the rough muslin was removed from the mirrors and her shoulders, she returned the wooden benches, which she used when she sat for her husband, and now would see no further service, and waited so patiently for his return. Every noise, every stirring of wind would stir her awake, certain that it was he. But the wind was simply the wind, carrying nothing but stale air, and the scent of death moved about. She heard by rumor that he had visited the others, and that woman. Invited them to examine his wounds, see for themselves a little show and tell. Even had dinner with them, but not her. She did not need to see the stigmata, feel the viscera, touch the space left by the spear. She had seen and touched enough of his wounds. From when he first skinned his knee, she needed no more. Just to hear his voice again once before muslin was draped over her mirrors would have sufficed. Now Jesus' response. A moment of explanation. The poem is titled Vidui. In Jewish tradition, Vidui are the prayers that we say on Yom Kippur, which is a public confessional. And it's an acrostic, it's an alphabetized acrostic. And we beat our chests because we're masochists, and we ask God for forgiveness. And I thought if Jesus were talking or confessing, he'd be doing it in Hebrew. Makes sense? So this is called Vidui, confession. Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Ta'inu, I never visited her. Never called even. After that day, we didn't speak again. At the end, I had nothing left to say to her. Should I have apologized for putting her through all that? Making her wait during the years of wandering, only to force her to watch her only child be tormented? To bear a child and bear his body? How could I have explained? She would not have understood, but would have dispensed forgiveness as she had once dispensed milk, producing only as much as needed. She would have begged me to stay, to make her a grandmother, to look after her in old age, to be by her withered hand as her weathered mind wandered. Who else, she would have asked? You are the last of my line. She would have begged me if only to say Kaddish for her and place a rock on her stone. That was a cross I could not bear. Better, I shouldn't speak with her again. I see the rabbi here for atonement. I tell him I reserved a suite of rooms for her in my father's house. Vial kolam Elohai slichot, slach lanu, mechal lanu, kaper lanu. For all these, God of forgiveness, forgive us, pardon us, grant us atonement. Before I introduce Melanie, who's nodding off there, I'm going to, pardon me. Oh, I see come inside. There's no room to come inside.